Okay, good morning. Okay, so let's start right where we ended yesterday. So yesterday I briefly described the basic components to design a hydrodynamics solver, which, as you have understood, is called the Godunov scheme. And I just want to outline that this is used in most of the modern codes that we use in galaxy formation today. AMR, but also moving mesh and SPH-like implementations, at least the modern ones. And so the key point here is that the way you solve the equations is a conservative way, so you conserve mass, momentum, and energy. And the basic component that you use to compute the fluxes is this Riemann solver. So that's basically the performance, how you can estimate the performance of such a method by comparing the numerical solution to a known analytical solution. So it's called the SOD test. It's basically a shock tube test. So you have a diaphragm at x equal half that separates two piecewise constant states, and then you let go at t equals 0, and you see a shock wave propagating to the right, a rarefaction wave propagating to the left, and a contact discontinuity in the middle. And then you can see basically all the key features of hydrodynamics flow and how they are captured by this numerical scheme. And you see the number of cells we use is reasonably low. And you can see that the numerical errors are mostly where you see kinks in the solution, and especially the discontinuities are the one that are the hardest to capture. And we understand where this smoothing of the numerical solution comes from. It's come from this numerical diffusion, right? So we call this the first order Godunov scheme because we assume that the solution, as I said yesterday, is piecewise constant inside each volume. So it's a finite volume method. And we assume that inside the volume, inside the cell, the solution is constant, right? And so that's what you get, right? And here we are using, I think, the HLLC Riemann solver, so it's basically one of the most accurate you can use. So there is not much improvement you can get unless you move to a new methodology. And this new methodology is basically referred to as high-order schemes. So it's, I'm going to just briefly explain the philosophy here, but if you move to a second-order scheme, which now assumes that the solution is not constant anymore in the cell, but it's linear, right? Then you will get an improved solution, as you can see here. So it's a second-order Godunov scheme. So if you flash back and forth, you see that you capture the contact discontinuity much better here. So the numerical diffusion is still there, but it's less, right? And the shock is also slightly improved, but not much. And you see that the smooth part of the solution, that's the key point, the rarefaction wave, is significantly better captured, right? So now one traditional way to improve even more is, of course, to go to even higher order. I will discuss this in a minute. But there is also another way, is to refine the mesh adaptively, as I explained for gravity yesterday. And so if you now refine the mesh based on the refinement criteria which triggers new cells where the gradient of the solution are too high, then you get the AMR solution. So that's an example here with roughly the same number of cells as before, but the cells are now placed optimally. So you see you have a very dense mesh here and here where the discontinuities are, and also mesh points tend to cluster near the steepest gradients, right? But here outside, where the solution is a constant, the mesh is degraded, so you have much less points here outside, right? And so that's basically the three approaches, the three different philosophies you can think of in order to solve those problems. So first, the basic, the first order Godunov schemes, then moving towards high order schemes, and then finally moving towards adaptive meshes. Okay? So moving meshes is the same idea, except you don't refine, you move the mesh points towards the regions of the flow that need more resolution. Okay, so briefly let me describe what we mean by very high order schemes. So that's something which is really being developed a lot, and of course it's been developed for a long time in engineering applications, I would say, but in astrophysics it's more recent. And I think it's a very promising avenue of research for computational astrophysics, although complicated, right? And so when we say very high order schemes, we say like very high order schemes. Like we are going towards representing the solutions with very high order polynomials. So it's not piecewise constant or piecewise linear. We go to parabolic or third order or fourth order or fifth order polynomial, right? And now the order becomes actually a variable, right? So it's usually called P. That's the order of the polynomial, P like polynome. So it's order of the polynomial representation. And the idea here is to design a methodology where P is an adjustable parameter of your simulation. And why not going to 10, right? Okay, so basically the idea is to develop, to project your solution inside each cell, inside each element, on a polynomial basis here. And the coefficients, basically the projection of your solution on this basis, are time dependent. And those coefficients are the new unknown, right, that you want to update with time. So before, right, we had only one unknown, which was the constant value of the density, for example, in the cell. Now we have much more unknowns, which is basically each coefficient, so the constant value, of course, but also the linear coefficient, the quadratic coefficient, and so on and so forth. So you can end up with 2,500 new coefficients per cell, and all of them are unknown that you need to update as a function of time. Right? So it's very expensive. Right? So now the idea is that, of course, you project, so that's the projection operator. So you take the scalar product of your initial condition, for example, on the polynomial basis, and you get the initial coefficients. And then now the idea is that that's your hyperbolic system of conservation law. And then you will project this equation also on the basis. Right? So you take the integral of the equation on the basis function. Right? And this is called the weak formulation of your system of equation. Right? So you're basically restricting your equation to the polynomial basis. And if you do that, so it's a relatively easy exercise to do. You just perform the integral using the fact that the solution is, of course, projected on the basis 2. And then you get a new equation, which is here, right? This line. And this equation is basically the numerical discretization as we did before, right? Except now it's on all the coefficients, right? So the first term here becomes this guy, which is nothing else but the projection on the basis. So that's the time derivative of each coefficient, right, times the normalization factor. Then this guy here, the flux part, you integrate by part. So that's the magic here. You integrate by part. And then you get two terms, a volume term, which stays like that, right? So you just have to integrate in the volume of the cell this quantity. And you know this guy because those are the basis function. Plus a surface term that comes from the integration by part. And the surface term, you have a flux which is defined at the interface of your element. So that's your element, and that's your interface of your element. And here you have a problem, a priori, right? Because how do you compute the flux when you have one element on the right with a basis function describing the solution, and another element on the left with another basis function describing the other solution? How do you find the unique flux in between the two? Well, we know the answer. We did it yesterday. You just solve the Riemann problem. Right? And so basically the idea is that you have the flux defined on this face as the solution of Riemann problem between those two elements. And that's what you do here. So basically you replace this guy by an integral on your face. And this is the solution of the Riemann problem with a left state and a right state. And then you're done. That's it, finished. So instead of having one equation to solve per variable, you have a lot of equations to solve per variable, one for each coefficient. Okay? And so that's relatively a well-known method, and it works very well for smooth solution. Right? So just to give you an example, so there is a nice paper by Shah et al. With an application to astrophysics, and I encourage you to read it. And what they did was to solve a problem with various orders here, second order, third order, fourth order, and this is another method which is close to what we did yesterday. And that's the norm of the error of whatever solution they compare to, an analytical solution, with respect to the number of elements. Right? And you see that for a second order method, the error goes down as the number of elements minus 2, which is why we call it second order. Right? But now if you move to third order or fourth order, you see that the slope is steeper. Right? So, for example, for 100 elements, you see that the fourth order method has an error which is almost 2 orders of magnitude smaller than the third order method, and so on and so forth. Right? So, of course, it's much more expensive. Right? As I told you, you have all these coefficients to integrate with time, and so it's really more expensive in terms of memory and in terms of time. Right? But now let's represent this in a slightly different approach here, which is to do the same error norm, but now versus the runtime. So now it includes how expensive, how much more expensive a higher order method is. And then you see that for a given error, so if you, for example, you're targeting an error of 10 to minus 5, right? You see that for a given error, let's not use 10 to minus 5 because there is no violet point. Let's use 10 to minus 6, for example. You see that for a given error, the highest order is the fastest, right? Because the second order error are per time step per element much faster, right? But since the error you're getting at is much larger, it's not so efficient. So you see, so it's for smooth solutions. Clearly, it's more efficient to use less element. So basically, you can use only, why not 10 elements, and you get an error which is comparable to a low-order method with 1,000 elements, right? So here, clearly, for a smooth solution, you want to use as few elements as possible, so only 10 mesh points. But with a fourth-order method, it's more efficient, right? So that's a very interesting direction to go to. Of course, it's as I said, right, repeatedly, it works only for smooth solution. And we know that in hydrodynamics, you have a lot of discontinuities. And so clearly, if you have a shock, if you have discontinuity, it doesn't work anymore. And so it's more efficient, actually, in this case, to do what I showed before, which is to refine the mesh. So you use a first-order method or a second-order method, but you refine the mesh close to discontinuity. Okay, so I think now the future of all this, and everybody is working on that, right, frantically, is to combine the two approaches. And that's called HP adaptivity. H for the mesh size, so you refine the mesh adaptively, and P for the polynomial order. You increase the polynomial order adaptively. And if you can detect automatically if you are in a smooth region of the flow, then obviously you can de-refine the mesh but increase the polynomial order. It's more efficient. Or if you are close to a discontinuity, you want to reduce the polynomial order because it's too expensive otherwise, but refine the mesh as much as you can, right? Okay. Okay, so that's the end of the hydrodynamics part. So now let's move to the second big chunk here, which is the MHD part. So as you have noticed, magnetic fields in galaxy formation are getting more and more into the game. Their exact impact to galaxy shapes, star formation efficiencies, luminosities is yet to be determined. It's not clear if it's so important, but for cosmic rays, for example, it's very important. For probably diffusion processes in galaxies, it's very important. So whether they play a central role, it's yet to be determined, but they are there, clearly, and they must play at least a second-order role. It's true that in the literature, you see more and more studies, including magnetic fields. And so I think it's for you, who are the young researchers here, you need to tackle this, or at least you need not to be afraid of tackling MHD problems, right? In our generation, magnetic fields are always the stupid question one asks at the end of a talk. What about magnetic fields, right? And then hand-wavy argument, not so important, blah, blah. Your generation, they are all included in your simulation, right? So, okay, so briefly, the equations are shown here. So it's basically the ideal MHD equation. So it's basically the equivalent of the Euler equation. So you have basically three conservation laws: mass, momentum, and energy. Except now, there is this B field here, which gives you an extra force, the Lorentz force, or magnetic stresses, an extra pressure, right? The total pressure is now the thermal pressure plus the magnetic pressure, And the total energy now has a different meaning because you have to add the internal energy, the kinetic energy, and the magnetic energy. So 3 conservation laws plus a new one, which is the conservation of the magnetic flux. Or it's also called the induction equation, right? Which features this nabla cross B cross V scary operator here. And so this is basically the electromotive force or the electric field, depending on what your favorite name. So that's the new, but it's also a conservation law, right? So it's still a hyperbolic system of conservation law, so you can still apply what we learned yesterday. There is one big catch, though. This line here, right? You need to make sure that you don't have magnetic monopoles in your solution. It's also called the divergence-free constraint for the magnetic field. This basically comes from the nature of the magnetic field, from the Maxwell's equation. And you have to preserve this in your numerical solution. Okay? And so that's the main difficulty here. Right? As I said, you have a system of conservation laws. So again, black box, you apply what we learned yesterday. But this is really the key problem here. Right? So how do you do that? So there are several approaches. The first one, the easy one, the one that basically generalizes what we did yesterday, is to use a finite volume philosophy to discretize the magnetic field too, right? And so now, for each cell, you define an average magnetic field in the cell as the volume average of the magnetic field inside the cell, right? So you're really strictly following the same approach as yesterday. And but then you're in trouble, because then if you do this, then the divergence of the magnetic field will not be preserved, and you need to deal with this problem, right? And so that's what we call in the jargon here divergence cleaning, right? Because after one time step, so if you apply the Godunov scheme as face value, as I described yesterday, you will have at the next time step a non-zero divergence, right? And it will be small, but it will be non-zero. And then what do you do, right? And so you have to clean this mess you just created, right? And so that's what we call divergence cleaning. So there are a lot of different approaches here. I will describe them, a few of them. The easiest one is the Powell scheme, which basically is not afraid of a non-zero divergence and is just incorporating it and proudly use it in the solution. Then there is, I would say, people who are ashamed of divergence, right? So, okay, they create divergence, but they are ashamed of it, so they remove it. So it's called the projection scheme. And then Deadners is basically a combination of the two, right? So it's basically the most modern approach, I would say. It's a combination of the two. And then in this paper, it's basically the absolute best you can do in this approach, right? So let me describe how it works quickly, right? So the first scheme, Powell scheme, it basically rewrites Maxwell's equation, assuming that you have magnetic monopoles. So it's a new universe in which you have magnetic monopoles, right? And then if you derive the ideal MHD equation, including magnetic monopoles, you find new equations, of course, with new terms. So I've shown here only the momentum conservation equation and the induction equation. And you see that you have those two guys here, which are proportional to div B, that enters in the equation, right? And so then you solve the problem using the Godunov methods. And of course, what you observe is that this guy here, especially this one, is proportional to the velocity. It advects away magnetic monopole. So if you have a fluid with a velocity field, you create magnetic monopoles, but those magnetic monopoles are advected away, right, in the flow. And numerical diffusion, that we have seen yesterday, will take care of diffusing these guys away, and nothing wrong will happen, right? So so that's the cool idea here. The other cool idea is that you have a system which is now strictly hyperbolic, so it's not the ideal MHD equation anymore. They are slightly different, and it has a lot of nice mathematical features. The big negative point, of course, is that your scheme is not conservative anymore. So these are not conservation laws anymore, right? Because you have a source term on the right-hand side. That's bad. When you have shocks, it's really bad. So the Rankine-Hugoniot relation are wrong, right? So the shock speed is slightly wrong, which in most applications is not that bad, right? I mean, but for some applications, it's usually bad. So the other issue, which is more subtle, is that you have this spurious force here. So it's a spurious force, which is collinear to the field. And so if you really want for your problem to satisfy the fact that the Lorentz force is perpendicular to the magnetic field, this spurious force, of course, doesn't satisfy this, right? So if your problem is really depending on the fact that you recapture the geometry of the Lorentz force, you're in trouble. This guy here add another channel for spurious magnetic field amplification, right? So you can have spurious dynamos, because instead of, again, forcing the electric field to be perpendicular to the velocity field and the magnetic field, which is the big constraint here, now you have this new guy, which is proportional to the velocity, which can create magnetic field amplification, possibly in situations where it should not be. Right? But again, it depends on your application. If your application doesn't really care about all this, fine, it will work. Right? Okay, so one additional thing is that you have a new wave. Instead of, so in MHD you have 7 waves, but if you use Powell scheme, you have an 8th wave, which is called the divergence B wave, which comes from this guy here, and it adds basically a new degrees of freedom in your methodology. Okay, so that's the Powell scheme. So now, if you're ashamed of that, if you want to get rid of this divergence B after one time step, you can. And that's a very nice method introduced by those guys here in the 80s. So the idea is that at the end of your time step, you have a non-zero divergence of B, right? And so if you want to clear this out, you can compute the divergence using whatever discretization. Here, that's one discretization, but you can use several discretization, right? And then what you do is you solve a Poisson's equation with a potential phi here, which satisfy Laplace phi or delta phi equal divergence of B. And so if you solve this, then if you use this potential to correct your magnetic field, by construction, if you take div of B n plus 1, you find div of B n plus half, which is not 0, minus Laplace of phi, which is equal to div B n plus half. So by construction, if you do that, your new field, the field that you have corrected, will have div B equals 0. Right? So it's called the projection method. And so you can show in more, I would say, understandable terms, this technique here actually gives you a new field, Bn plus 1, which is the closest to the old one, closest in the sense of the L2 norm, right, the L2 distance, which satisfies div B equals 0. Right? So that's the idea. So if you have a magnetic field that you get after your time step, which has div B non-zero, this solution will give you the closest that satisfies div B equals 0. So that's a nice way to clean the mess you created, right? The problem is that this Poisson equation is non-local. So what it does is that it takes the error you've made and it spreads them to correct the fact that it's non-zero divergence to arbitrary large distances, right? Because it's a completely non-local operator here, right? So you can, if you make an error here, it can affect your solution at the other side of the box, right? So that's the problem. And of course, this correction of the magnetic field will, of course, change the magnetic pressure. And then, since you conserve the total energy, your thermal pressure will be affected by that, right? Which is not very good. And it will be affected in a non-local way, meaning that if you have a divergence B created here in a shock, for example, it will change your pressure at the other side of the box. So again, in a lot of cases, it works very nice, right? So it depends on your application, right? But in some cases, it fails. So because of this non-local correction. Okay, and so as I said again, Dettner is a combination of the previous steps. So you use Powell's method, and with this approach, except you don't solve the Poisson equation completely. You just solve it a few iterations, right? So you use a relaxation scheme for the Poisson's equation, and you just perform a few iterations, so you correct a little bit, right? So you kind of get rid of this non-local effect here. Okay, so this is basically the finite volume approach. If you want to use this, that's basically what you have to do. Now there is another approach, I think, which is much better, which is called the constrained transport approach, which has been actually introduced by those guys here, and which is used in a lot of codes. And so here, the idea is that you give up on representing the magnetic field as a finite volume discretization, and you use instead a finite surface approximation, right? And what is that? Because actually the induction equation, it's much more natural to reformulate it in an integral form using a surface element for the field. Why? Because you can use Stokes' theorem, right? And Stokes' theorem in this case is a much more natural integral form of the induction equation than the divergence theorem, which is a volume-based approach, right? And so the idea is that you write this as an integral form, so you can get rid of the first curl operator and transform it into a line integral around the surface element where your field is defined. Okay, and so now you can define your field as a surface average instead of a volume average as before, right? And on the surface element, that is defining one face of your volume. And so you have now 6 magnetic fields, which are the normal components to each face. And this guy here is the electric field, or the electromotive force, and is defined on the edges, right? So now you have a completely new discretization, completely different than the original Godunov scheme, which is based on the surface average for the field and on the line average for the electromotive force, or the electric field. Okay, so you see that now you have your hydro variable, density, momentum, total energy, are still defined in the volume, right? So now that's a complication, right? Because now you have what we call a staggered mesh. You have a mesh which is staggered in the sense that one set of variables, density, momentum, energy, are defined as a volume average, and you can assign them to the center of the cell, right? While the magnetic field is defined as a surface average, and you can assign the location point at the center of the surface of the mesh, right? So you have this duality, these dual meshes, which makes it a little bit more complicated. So now you can actually, using this definition, and for the electric field, this definition, you can now derive the discrete form of your equation. And they are here, so that's the free equation. These are surface averages, times n plus 1 times n. And then the equivalent of the fluxes that we had before are now replaced by the electromotive force average over a line element, right? And now you have the time average electromotive force. So this is exactly the equivalent of the Godunov method that I described yesterday, except now they are for surface average magnetic field using not fluxes, but line average electric fields. And the beauty of that is that if you now compute div of bn plus 1, you can show that it's equal to div bn plus, and all these guys cancel each other, right? And if you add them up, so if you basically you add them the free and the free, you see that this guy will cancel with this one will cancel with this one, and this one will cancel with this one. So by construction, you satisfy div b n plus 1 equal div b n. And so if you are choosing an initial condition which satisfies div b 0 equals 0, then div b will be preserved and will be equal to 0 all the time. So you never introduce spurious divergence in this technique, right? So it vanishes exactly, and it vanishes by construction, right? Because you have defined the electric field and the magnetic field like that. So I think that's the very powerful approach to discretize the whole thing. The catch, of course, the big catch, is how do you compute this electric field, right? And that's not easy. And there is a price to pay, as you will see in a minute. So let's go back to 2D because it's easier to understand in 2D. So let's reformulate everything in 2D, right? So we have our induction equation here, where E is the electromotive force vector. And in 2D, so the B field is defined like that, right, as surface average here. So these are my B field are the red vectors here. And the electromotive force is defined at the corner points, right? And it's in 2D, it's only in the z direction, so it's basically a scalar, if you want. Okay, so if you apply, again, Stokes' theorem, you find your equation here, your time evolution equation. And now you have this electromotive force, Ez, which is defined at the corner point. Right? So now the divergence of the field is computed like that. And you can see that all these guys will cancel each other, and you will find exactly 0. Right? OK, so that's the 2D summary of what we described earlier in 3D. So now, how do you compute those guys? How do you compute Ez? And actually, here, the idea is that you have exactly like for the Godunov schemes, you have a Riemann solver to solve, a Riemann problem. Right? So for each corner point here, right, you have 4 possible values for the electric field. And those 4 possible values are using the 4 velocities and the 4 magnetic field values for these 4 cells. Right? And so you need to compute the electric field at this corner point here, at the intersection of these 4 cells. But you have 4 initial states to start with. Right? And so the result of that is a 2-dimensional Riemann solver. Right? So you need to design a 2-dimensional Riemann solver that is the solution of a 2-dimensional Riemann problem. Okay? So that's the big price to pay here. Okay? Because then you can then compute the electric field, which is properly upwinded, right? Using what we said yesterday, in order to stabilize your scheme, you need to use the upwind value, right? And the upwind value here is now defined in a 2D sense, not in a 1D sense. So that's the electric field you're looking for. And the blue arrow here is the velocity field, for example. And so if you have the velocity field is pointing in this direction, that it means you need to use this electric field, the one here, the upwind value. Right? So if you design a Riemann solver like that, which in the very simple case can be actually exactly found like that, right? What you find is again the same result as yesterday. You find that the electric field is actually the average electric field at this point using the 4 states around, and a correction term, which is a diffusive term, which will stabilize the solution. Right? That's the result of your Riemann solver. Okay? Except now it's directly in 2D. So you need to be able to do this in 2D. Right? And 2D Riemann solvers are more challenging than 1D Riemann solvers because you have a lot of complicated waves interaction going on. Right? So, okay, so those guys are the stabilizing term. So it's basically the numerical magnetic diffusion. So a lot of people have developed 2D Riemann solvers, so they're listed here. And again, there is three versions that you can find in this literature, which are relatively simple to understand. And they're all based on this HLL philosophy that I described yesterday, based on waves. Except now you don't have 2 waves, you have 4 waves. That are moving away from this corner point. And using those 4 waves, you can use those conservation laws and find your 2D Riemann solver. So you have the Lax-Friedrich Riemann solver, which is, again, the average of the 4 electric fields or electromotive force for the 4 initial piecewise constant states. And you add a diffusive term, which will stabilize the solution. So that's the HLL version, and then there is an HLD Riemann solver, which is the equivalent of a HLC Riemann solver, which is the most accurate one you can find in this market, right? So exactly the same idea as before, except now you have this finite surface representation of the magnetic field. By construction, dV is preserved. Of course, there is a price to pay, which is to use those guys, which are actually more expensive than not using them, right? Okay, so that's basically the conclusion here. So as I said, a lot of applications do not require very complicated techniques like that, right? A lot of applications, you use Powers method, you advect away magnetic monopoles, and it works, right? Except that sometimes it doesn't work. Right? And you're never sure. You're never really sure. There is a rule of thumb, though, is that supersonic magnetic turbulence, usually nothing works, right? So, and that's the problem we have to tackle in astrophysics. So if you have to deal with supersonic turbulence with, or superalvenic turbulence, which is basically the term here, a lot of those methods will fail because you're going to have a very complicated flows with very high Mach numbers. I mean, you have to be able to derive very robust schemes in order to survive this thing, right? And unfortunately, that's what we have to do in galaxy formation. We have to deal with supersonic turbulence. I think in our case, it's very challenging, much more challenging than other applications. Okay, so let's move to the second part of what I want to discuss today, which is radiation. So, of course, as you have seen from a lot of talks yesterday and the day before, radiative processes are playing a central role here. I mean, the cooling, also radiative processes as a diagnostic, right? In astrophysics, we use this radiation transfer quite a lot. Now, what I want to discuss here is a more challenging thing in my mind, is that can we include radiative processes while we are performing the hydrodynamics, right? So the goal here is to do what is called radiation hydrodynamics, right? So not radiation as a post-processing of your simulation, but radiation as part of the modeling process, again, could it have an impact on the galaxy formation physics itself? So I think that's something that we are doing more and more. For example, the obvious case is cosmic ionization, where new stars are photoionizing the environment and heating up the universe, which has an impact on the formation of the smallest galaxies, right? So it's an obvious application. But there are a lot of other applications. Right? So again, I will describe this from the very basic thing. And I will show you some applications and examples. So what we are trying to solve here is the radiative transfer equation, which is again a Boltzmann equation. So exactly like for dark matter, where there is no collision term, or for the Euler equation, where I have a very high collision term. Here it's the same thing, right? You basically conserve the number of photons in phase space, right, on the left-hand side. And then the right-hand side is the equivalent of the collision term, for the photon, basically the absorption of the radiation and the emission of new radiation, right? So that's the equivalent of collision term. So it's basically the same physics as ideal MHD and as dark matter dynamics, except that we don't use the same notation, and that's why we need to redefine everything, right? So of course, the source terms are a collection of microscopic processes, which are many, and I will not list them all, but that's the key point, right? What microscopic physics do you need to include in your problem, right? Okay, so one interesting approach here is instead of trying to solve this directly in phase space, which is what you're doing if you want to solve directly the radiative transfer equation, you can use the moments of the radiative transfer equation, except that now the moments are not over velocity space, they are over angular space, right? Because that's what we do with radiation that moves at the speed of light. And of course, the angular space is two variable, and so the third degrees of freedom is in nu, the photon energy, right? So you have velocity space, 3 degrees of freedom, angular space and energy space, 3 degrees of freedom, we're good. So you can define this average over the angle, which gives you the radiation energy, a scalar. And if now you define the first moment by multiplying by the angle, you get a vector. So that's the angle pointing in the direction of the ray. You get a vector, which is the radiation flux, okay? And you can also define a second order moment by taking n cross n, so it's a tensor, and then you get the pressure tensor, right? So those are the definition of the moments of the radiation field. And now you can take the moments of this equation, So the zeroth order moment, if you integrate over the angle, you will get the energy equation. And if now you multiply by n, so here you get a tensor, you get the flux equation. And then you can multiply by n cross n, and you get a third equation, and a fourth, and a fifth, and you have an infinite hierarchy of moments, and you're back to square one, right? So here, these moments equation here are interesting because they look exactly like fluid equation, right? So again, we're back to the methodology we are familiar with. Except there is a big catch here is what do we do with this pressure tensor, right? And it's not like an ideal fluid where we know the equation of state. Here we have this pressure tensor, and we don't know what it is because it depends crucially on the geometry of the radiation field, on how the intensity is distributed with the angle. And you have the source term here also, so average over the angle, which is the absorption of radiation, and the source function. And that's the absorption of the flux. So these equations are quite standard, and a lot of numerical techniques are designed on this moments equation. Right? And of course, the catch here is how do you compute the pressure tensor? That's the main problem here. Right? It's the equivalent of a Riemann solver, if you want, in a hydrodynamical case. Okay. So now, once we have those moments equation, we can actually couple them to the hydrodynamics just by energy conservation. So everything which is absorbed by the radiation is taken away from the fluid, and everything which the fluid is radiating is given to the radiation through the source function. So you can now integrate over the angle and define the heating function here, which is basically the absorption of radiation will heat the fluid. And the cooling function, that's the emissivity of radiation by the fluid, is basically a cooling term for the fluid. Right? And so you get a new energy equation for the fluid, which is the heating as a plus and the cooling as a minus. Right? So that's where the cooling comes from. Of course, you have the same conservation law between radiation and the fluid for the momentum equation. And now you have a term here that comes from the conservation of photon momentum, which is the radiation force, which is the integral over the frequency of this. And this momentum actually is corresponding to this term in the flux equation. Right? So everything is conserved. Right? So between matter and radiation, nothing is lost, everything is conserved. Okay? And the radiative force is, of course, something that could have an impact on your fluid evolution. Okay? So the physics you want to include in the context of galaxy formation, I mean, it can be arbitrarily complicated, but the basic thing we are dealing here is the photoionization of hydrogen and helium. You can also look at the photodissociation of molecular hydrogen, for example, or CO. So you have to deal with photodissociating radiation. Right? And of course, you can also deal with the absorption of radiation and the emission of radiation by dust grains. Right? So I think those are the three main stuff you can do in the context of galaxy formation. And of course, they don't apply at the same scales. Right? So if you look at galaxy formation on large scales, probably photoionization, especially at the epoch of ionization, is the thing you can do. At smaller scales, inside the galaxy, again, photoionization, H2 regions around young stars, they can have an impact on heating up your gas, right? But you can, at small scales, you can also look at the photodissociation of molecule. If you want to form H2 molecule, you have to deal with this photodissociating radiation and propagate it. And then on even smaller scales, the coupling of the radiation with dust grain in the infrared domain is interesting, right? So now, how do you deal with that, right? So there are many approaches here. They're all suffering from the same issues, which is that radiation is problematic because of the chemistry. So you have a lot of those chemical reactions that will enter into the absorption and emission of radiation here. So that's governed by a lot of chemical reaction here. And those chemical reactions have very short timescales. There is another problem also, is that the radiation moves at the speed of light. And that's very fast, right? And you see that this thing here, the C here, will give you a courant factor, that I defined yesterday. And so the wave speed for the radiation is basically the speed of light. Right? So the time step you will have to use in order to stabilize your numerical scheme, whatever it is, will probably be very small. Okay, so that's also another issue which is usually described in a jargon as stiff terms. Stiff means they have time scales which are incredibly smaller than the natural time scale of the hydro. Right? So now there is another also interesting thing I will describe later, is that it seems that there is you have this dichotomy between SPH and AMR for hydrodynamical method, or I would say Lagrangian method versus Eulerian method in a more kind of high-level way. And in this context of radiative transfer, you also have a similar dichotomy. Right? You have ray tracing method, I will describe them in a minute, versus the moment-based approach. And they're kind of the same. Right? In one case, you solve the radiative transfer using a Lagrangian approach. You follow the light rays. Right? So that's the equivalent of a Lagrangian approach. While the moment-based method, you solve radiative transfer looking at each position in space, how the moments are changing with time. Right? So it's like an Eulerian approach. So that's the same dichotomy. So, okay, before we move into this radiative transfer part, the first basic impact of radiation is cooling, right? And so cooling, that's something that you don't need to worry too much, because it's just this guy here. And if you assume that your radiation is optically thin, meaning that each emitted photon is lost forever and will never come back, and it will travel in the universe as a straight line, then you don't need to solve those equations, right? You don't need to solve this. You don't care, right? Photons are emitted and they never come back, right? So that's the optically thin limit. And so for the optically thin limit, you just need to have the cooling which is emitted locally, and the photons are leaving the crime scene, right? And heating is basically a UV background which is coming from somewhere in the universe, which will heat your fluid locally, right? And so with this approach, so background heating versus cooling locally, you don't need radiative transfer. You just need these heating and cooling functions, right? So here you just plug in your cosmological background for the photon, and here you plug in the source function for your microscopic processes. So then you get the cooling function. So that's the well-known thing here, which actually is responsible for a lot of strong effects in galaxy formation. So that's the list of processes I'm going to jump over. That's basically what you get for the cooling function. If now you have a UV background, right? So now it's not only dependent on the temperature anymore, but it's depending on the density also. And you see it's represented here as the net cooling rate, basically heating minus cooling, right? And that's the equilibrium line. So that's where heating equals cooling. And that's above, it's cooling. And that's below, it's heating, right? So if your gas turns out to be below this line, then it will heat up. And if you wait long enough, it will reach this line and stay there. If your gas is above this line, it will cool down and reach the line and stay there, right? So that's basically the cooling balance, or heating and cooling balance, that describe an optically thin plasma, which is basically the ISM, right? So this case is without any metal. So it's just hydrogen and helium. So of course it's a bit simplified. And now you can add metal, and then you get a very different picture, right? So much more cooling. And also much more cooling at low temperature, right? So you see that now the equilibrium curve will bring you towards 10 Kelvin, which is the temperature of the molecular cloud, right? So and so you have those cooling processes here at high density and low temperature, which is basically the hyperfine transitions of atomic species. You have also CO and H2 cooling and dust cooling, right, as important coolant. So that's basically the physics of cooling and heating here, which, as I said, is the only thing you need to take care of if you have an optically thin set of conditions. Now, if the photons are not optically thin, meaning they will be absorbed inside the galaxy, at least, then you cannot do that. You have to solve for the radiative transfer equation, right? So that's the big difference. So now how do you do that? So there is, as I said, there is two approaches here. So the first one is oops. Okay, the first one is the ray tracing method. So the ray tracing method comes, it's a very old method, right? So I've put here one example from Tom Abel, which was developed in the context of cosmic ionization, so galaxy formations. That's why I want to put it here. So basically the idea is that if you have a source of radiation, like a star or a galaxy, you describe radiative transfer along light rays, which are straight line. And of course, you have to discretize the angular space with those light rays. And the key thing here is how do you discretize your angular domain, right? And so it's clearly a phase space method. And the phase space discretization here will play a very important role in the quality of the numerical solution. And so here, traditionally, you have two types of method. The long characteristic method, and so you have a recent, it's a very old method, but a recent paper that describes it is listed here, where you basically draw around each cell or around each source of radiation, you draw straight lines that cross the entire computational domain. And then you have to draw those lines dense enough so that they intersect with all the cells. That's the problem. And then you can get the radiation field. And then what you do is very easy. You just integrate this equation. You just integrate this equation along one light ray, which is given by this n vector. And then you integrate this, so it's very easy to do, right? Along the light ray. Right? Of course, you have to do a lot of those integration because you have a lot of those long characteristics, and that's the expensive part. Right? And if you don't use enough light rays, then it's going to be weird, right? And wrong. The short characteristic method is a different approach. You basically have short light rays that connects neighboring cells, just neighboring cells. Right? So you're looking at the propagation of radiation just between two neighboring cells, so you don't have to cross the entire box. And of course, it's more approximate because you lose the non-local aspect of radiation. Right? The adaptive ray tracing method that is developed by Tom Abel here is quite clever. They basically split the rays adaptively in order to adapt locally to the resolution of the mesh. Right? And you can also merge them if you don't need to have so many rays. Right? And then there is the Monte Carlo approach, which is yet another approach where you have actually photon packets which moves along straight lines, but you can actually make them scatter and change direction too. Right? So it's a bit more complicated. And that's what is being developed here by Pavlik et al. So the ray tracing method is, I think, is very good. It captures the geometry of the radiation very well if you have enough light rays, of course. So the angular distribution can be very complex. And it uses an infinite speed of light because you basically you follow your light ray at infinite speed, right? So you froze completely the hydro, you freeze the hydro, and then you shoot light rays and you watch them cross the box at infinite speed, and then you have your radiation in the box at any given time. Right? I think it's also a problem, right? Because in some case, I will show you, infinite speed of light is not a good idea because the speed of light is finite, right? So it's very large, okay, but it's not infinite. The big negative aspect for that is that it's very sensitive to the number of sources, right? So you have to shoot light rays around each sources. So if you have millions of stars in your simulation, you're in trouble, right? So that's a big issue, I think. The other issue is in order to deal with scattering of light, it's also very expensive because you create new directions and the complexity of your system will increase exponentially. So, but there are a lot of good and bad aspects. So the second approach, as I said, was the moment method. So the moment method is to basically, so let me go back. It's basically to solve those equations, right? Except you're in trouble because you don't know what is the shape of this guy, right? So there are many, many different approaches here. So, okay, let me show what I did here. Okay. So there is one very simple approach, which is called the M1 closure, which is summarized here. The idea is to write the Eddington, the pressure tensor here, as being proportional to E times the Eddington tensor. So we didn't do anything here. It's just a new, we define a new quantity. But this is a dimensionless tensor. And then here, the trick is to assume that this tensor will describe two regimes. One regime, which is an optically thick regime, where the radiation is isotropic. So that will be this guy. That's the isotropic radiation case. And then this guy is the purely optically thin single stream regime where you have one source shooting in one direction. So that's the other extreme case. And then the idea of the M1 method is to have a linear combination of the two. Right? And the linear combination is given by this function here, which depends on the reduced flux. So this actually is an ultra simplified model, right, which has the very good property of being local, meaning it depends only on the local flux and on the local energy of radiation. Right? It gives you also the two extreme regime naturally, isotropic and beamed radiation, right, which is great too, except that it fails in more complex geometries, right, because obviously with this very simple parametrization, you can't capture very complex geometries, right? And I will give you an example in a minute. So what is also very interesting is that you see that this guy, which depends on the flux, it's a closure that looks like an equation of state, right? And you can show that what you get here is a hyperbolic system of conservation laws, which is not obvious because radiation transfer is not hyperbolic in general, right? You have a lot of non-local effect. But the M1 closure is an approximation, and this approximation gives you a hyperbolic system of conservation law. So you can then apply the Godunov methodology like a black box, and it will work, right? But it's an approximation, right? So the M1 closure is a very big approximation. But I think this is a very nice property. Then you can use Godunov method and apply the same trick with Riemann solvers and so on and so forth, right? So it works quite nicely for simple cases. So that's a point source, and that's the radiation you get around the point source. Okay, it's as good as it can get. That's beam radiation. So you see, you get the shadow relatively well, although you have some numerical diffusion here. It's the first order Godunov scheme here, right? Very recently, a second order version of that has been developed, and you get this diffusion effect, of course, reduced quite a lot. That's the case of two sources, two isotropic sources. Okay, it's not so good, but that's a total failure, right? So you have two beam radiation. This is all in vacuum, by the way. This is all in vacuum. This is two beams of radiation, and they should those two beams should just cross each other and ignore each other, and, right? But here you have a collision of photons, right? Not good. And so you see, instead of having the proper solution, which is that the radiation should go as a straight line, it collides and emits radiation on the side, right? And why is that? Because when you sit here, the M1 closure allows you only to have one direction, not two. And here, in order for this to work, you should have the possibility to describe your angular distribution with two sources, one here and one there. But you can't, you have only one direction. So you try to fit this and you fit in the middle, right? And then that's why you get this, right? So the M1 closure is good, but not perfect, right? So that's a very important point to keep in mind. Okay, but so how does it work in practice? Actually quite well. So this is a photoionization problem. So that's the Strömgren sphere, if you want. So you have a star sitting in a dense environment, and the radiation will create a photoionized bubble. And this is the H1 and H2 fraction, right? So the H1 is reduced in the center, and then is 1 outside, and H2 is the other way around, right? And that's a comparison between a moment method in blue and a ray tracing method in red, right? And so they're in relatively good agreement. There is a so that's the only thing I want to say here. Something with the speed of light I mentioned earlier. That's a simulation with a finite speed of light, so the correct value of the speed of light. So it's a photoionization problem where you have a cosmological box with small galaxies that are inserted here, and you look at the radiation growing around them, right, from 2 time steps here. And that's the temperature. And so that's the moment method, and that's the ray tracing method. Right? And you see that the ray tracing method, the size of the photoionized region is much bigger. Right? And actually, the reason is that the code here uses infinite speed of light. And if you use the proper speed of light, you should find this. Right? And so we did it the other way around. So what we did was to multiply the speed of light by 100 in the moment method. And then you get something which is in much better agreement, although not perfect, but much better with the infinite speed of light case. Right? So just to say that, yeah, so that's the quantitative measurement of that. So that's the volume fraction of the ionized hydrogen as a function of time, so it's increasing, right? And so that's the correct speed of light value, and that's the infinite speed of light value, right? And so you see that they match quite well. So you see that there is a mismatch which is significant here. Okay, I'm going to skip this. Okay, so now that's basically the end of my my second part for today. So just a summary of what we did. And I want to outline the different dichotomies or the different religions that we have in our community, which are quite interesting. And in the end, they're all very complementary, right? So for dark matter, we have seen the tree code and the fast multiple version of it, which is very fast, and the adaptive particle mesh techniques. And they all have different pros and cons. Although I would say that the tree code / fast multiple is really the most efficient in terms of how fast it can be, right? So I would favor you to use this, but for pure dark matter problems. But the adaptive particle mesh technique in conjunction with the multigrid method is also quite efficient, although not as efficient as the tree code. For hydrodynamics, you have AMR versus SPH. That's the old dichotomy, except now we have also moving meshes, which is kind of in between. So it's a trichotomy. For radiation, we have radiative transfer versus moment-based method, right? And all pros and cons, and all these methods can be combined with any of the others, right? I mean, and each time you get different results. For example, people who use the flash code in Germany, Steffi Walsh, for example, and Thorsten Naab, they use the flash code, which is an AMR code, but they use a tree code for the gravity. Right? So anything is possible, right? So you can really do anything here. Okay, so what is really cool, I think, is that now it's possible to perform galaxy simulation like this one with radiation coupled to the hydrodynamics. And here what you see is the radiation intensity in different photon bands, photon groups, which corresponds to different ionization energies of hydrogen, helium-1 and helium-2. And you see them face on and side on. And you see that it's done while the hydro is running, right? And so I think that's really the frontier now, today, to be able to do those simulations and to have now a feedback of the radiation transfer on the hydrodynamics, right? So, okay. So, of course, what is missing here, what we have not discussed so far, and that's what I'm going to do next, is what has been mentioned many times already, which are the subgrid processes, right? And how do you deal with those subgrid processes? And I will discuss this now. So here, clearly, it's a complete can of worms, and I want to take a point of view which is slightly different than maybe you have seen so far. The key point here, I think the key weakness is the lack of predictivity, right? Everything I've said before, you have nice equations, Vlasov equation, Boltzmann equation, radiative transfer equation, and you want to solve them the best you can. Of course, you have a lot of issues, right? Numerical diffusion, speed of light, time stepping, okay. That all this keeps up awake at night, but at least you have the possibility to solve those equations and give in the end a prediction which comes from first principles. and the accuracy of this prediction depends only on numerical factors, right? But now there is this other class of problems which are called subgrid processes, where actually sometimes you have to describe processes that are not even understood. We don't have even equations for that, right? I mean, star formation, I mean, Yves has explained what are the current picture of star formation. It's very complete, and it's very impressive, but there is still a lot of unknown there, right? And so if you want to design a subgrid model where actually the theory is not finished yet, what does that mean, right? I mean, you're basically incorporating in a subgrid model a lack of knowledge. It's not just a coarsening operation of something you know very well at small scales, right? It's more than that. You're modeling something that you don't really know at small scales, right? So it's really complicated. There's different levels here, right? So the thing I want to do now is to try, although you can argue that it's not the case, but I will try to describe subgrid processes as, okay, let's assume we know everything on small scales, which is a big assumption, right? How can we connect this to the larger scales of the simulation with your gigantic finite volumes, right? So that's the point of view I want to use now, right? So let's hope it works. So I will start with something which actually is a very famous subgrid model in engineering, which is the so-called subgrid turbulent model. And it's been used in engineering very successfully for many decades. And the idea is to say that if you have a mesh resolution which is significantly larger than the scale at which turbulence is dissipated, which is microscopic scales close to the mean free path of the atoms and the molecules, then you're in trouble because you don't capture the full turbulent cascade all the way down to the dissipation scales, right? And so what the engineers have developed in the context of airspace industry and so on is a subgrid model where you add this information that you don't know how to capture given your limited resolution, but you know it's there and you know the physics well. It's a turbulent cascade, right? And you want to see how introducing this information that is lost by the code back into the equation could change the physics. Right? And I think that's something that we should try to do more and more. And actually, a lot of people are working on these lines in astrophysics. And let me briefly explain how it works. So the idea is that you smooth your unresolved scales over a scale delta, a spatial scale delta, which, to simplify the discussion, is equal to the grid size. Right? So basically, you replace your density field, for example, or any of the fluid quantities, which depends on the macroscopic coordinate x, but also on the microscopic coordinate x prime, which is basically where you are inside your cells. Right? So x could be the cell position, right? xi, one cell, poof, and x prime is the coordinate inside this cell. Okay? And then what you do is you define the average density inside this cell as a smoothing operation. So you convolve by a smoothing window, and the smoothing window has a size which is equal to the cell size. Right? And of course, it's a convolution operation here. And so by doing this, you can define the average density, which is your numerical density. That's the density you define. So if you want, that's the finite volume. It's basically the finite volume integration of your density field. Okay? So for compressible flows, again, in astrophysics, you're dealing with compressible flows. You can also define a new average, which is called the Favre averaging, which is the average of rho v. So it's basically the momentum divided by the average density. And that gives you the Favre average velocity. Right? You can also, if you want, define the average velocity. So you replace rho by v here. And v here, it's not going to be the same. Right? You're going to have two different velocities. Right? One will be mass-weighted, this one, and the other one will be volume-weighted. Right? And the two are different. For incompressible flows, you can use the volume-weighted or the mass-weighted, doesn't care, because the density is uniform. But for compressible flows, it's a very significant difference. So if you do that, So basically, you can then define your fluctuation, so as the average value plus a fluctuation inside the cell. Right? Same thing for the velocity, except now you define the fluctuation velocity with the Favre average plus the fluctuation. And for the magnetic field, since we're dealing with MHD, you do the same. Right? So that's basically the idea. So now what you can do, you can inject those guys using this definition back into your ideal MHD equation. Right? You can do that. And then you have equations with basically two terms, average term and a fluctuation, and of course all the products of those terms. Right? So you're going to end up with a lot of new terms. Right? And then what you do is you take the average of the equation. And again, it's going to be your average system of equation. And if you do that, then again, magic happens. You obtain new equations, modified equations, again, right? Except that those equations are on the mean values, okay? And those are your true numerical values. Those are your volume average values. So the mass conservation equation looks exactly the same, except, important point, that's the V tilde, not the V bar, right? If you have used the V bar here, then it's not, there will be an additional term. But if you use the V tilde, then it's simpler. It's exactly like the mass conservation. Then momentum conservation will be the same as before, exactly the same as before with average values everywhere, except now you have new guys that pops up because of the averaging thing. And those new guys are due to the fluctuations. And I will show in a minute how they are defined. Same thing for the induction equation. The induction equation, if you take the average of the induction equation after injecting this and this in it, you have the induction equation of the average quantities. We are familiar with this one, plus a new term, which is the curl of a new electromotive force, which is called the turbulent electromotive force. Right? So now those guys are defined as the turbulent Reynolds stress. So it's really like a turbulent stress. It's like a force, if you want. And that's the Maxwell stress. So it's a force due to the fluctuation of the magnetic field. And this one is called the turbulent electromotive force, or the turbulent electric field. Right? And so everything I did here is, there is no approximation yet. Right? It's just an exact derivation on how you can split the density, velocity, and magnetic fields into an average value and a fluctuation. Right? We just split like that using this definition for the averaging. Right? So I've not made any approximation yet, so it's still a first principle kind of approach. Right? Yeah, it's actually absorbed by the tilde. So if you use the tilde, then it stays like that. That's why we use this Favre averaging. If you don't use it, if you use a bar, then you have an additional term, which is mass diffusion. Yeah. So it's really a way to simplify the math. Right? Okay, so now what are those new terms? Right? So actually a lot of new terms came in. Right? So let me define them. So we have the turbulent kinetic energy, which is actually the kinetic energy. So it's the average of rho, but delta V squared. So it's the kinetic energy of the turbulent velocity. So it's the kinetic energy associated with the fluctuation, right? And so if you have no fluctuation, this is zero, right? So if you have you go back to the original ideal MHD equation, there is no fluctuation, so everything is zero here. So this is really due to the internal fluctuations. And you can also define this as rho bar times the turbulent velocity dispersion sigma t. The Reynolds stress tensor is defined like that. So it's basically the cross term of the velocity fluctuation. The Maxwell stress tensor is defined like that. So it's the cross term of the fluctuation in delta B. Right? And actually, you can see that those tensors, the Reynolds tensor and the Maxwell tensor, have a trace, a non-zero trace, which then will kind of guide us in how to deal with those terms later. And then the turbulent electromotive force is the average of the velocity fluctuation across the magnetic field. Right? So it's really the electromotive force due to the fluctuating velocity field. Okay? So now, what you can do is you can, now that you have this equation on V bar, V tilde, right? You have an equation that describes the evolution of V tilde. You have an equation that describes the evolution of V, right? That's the original ideal MHD equation. So now you can derive, by subtracting this guy with this guy, you can derive an equation for delta V, right? So you can take the time derivative of delta V as the time derivative of V minus the time derivative of V tilde, which is here, right? And by doing this, you can actually find a new equation on the evolution of the turbulent kinetic energy. And again, no approximation here. Everything is so, and that's the equation that describes the evolution of the kinetic energy, of the turbulent kinetic energy, this guy, right? So that's an unresolved turbulence. And this depends on those guys, right? And there is this term here, which is the dissipation of turbulence on small scale. So that's the dissipation of turbulence all the way down to the turbulent cascade at very small scale that you don't resolve. And now there is also a new guy that comes in here, which is the turbulent heat flux. So for those who derived the fluid equation using the Boltzmann equation, a lot of stuff looks exactly the same, right? So basically the idea here in this methodology is that you can replace in your mind the turbulence by small particles moving around. Those small particles are small vortices, turbulent vortices, and they are moving around, they are creating the velocity fluctuations. And we are just deriving moments equation of these unresolved vortices moving around in the cell. Right? And of course now the problem is that we don't know those guys. We don't know what is the shape of those guys. Right? All these tensors and heat flux vector, they're all unknown. Right? We don't know what they are. Right? And the only way to compute them is to know what are the velocity fluctuations, but we don't know them. Right? So basically, yeah, and we can also derive an equation for the magnetic edicity, which is defined like that, right? Exactly like for this, right? So, I mean, you can look at this paper. It's a nice recent derivation of all this. So now, how do we do? Now we're stuck, right? Now we're stuck, exactly like you're stuck with an infinite hierarchy of moments. You have the same problem here, right? So now we need to do a model, right? A subgrid model. Okay, but this subgrid model, it's very popular and very successful in engineering, right? I want to stress this point. Right? So here the model is to do an analogy between those little vortices and molecules in a fluid. So you treat them the same way. You say, okay, I have my vortices, they bounce around each other, they disappear by viscous dissipation, they appear by some large-scale processes, and they are distributed using a probability distribution function that I don't know. But I can make an analogy with these little vortices and molecules in a fluid. And then you can say, okay, those tensors, those three guys that I've introduced, I can come up with a model for them, which is inspired by microscopic models, where, for example, you can derive viscosity, the Navier-Stokes equation, based on a first-order approximation of the Boltzmann equation. And so here the idea is exactly the same, so it's called Boussinesq approximation. You just use the same analogy. And if you do that, then you can show that the Reynolds stress can be written, again, it's an analogy, it's an approximation, right? As exactly as the viscous stress tensor using the average velocity times the coefficient. Right? And this coefficient, it's basically a viscosity coefficient, the same thing as the viscosity coefficient. And you basically, again, make the analogy of the mean free path of the molecules and the velocity dispersion of the molecules with the travel distance of the largest vortices before they disappear and the velocity dispersion of those vortices, right? And so you make the same analogy, and then you know that the viscosity coefficient will be delta, the size of the mesh, which corresponds to largest vortices, and the sigma t, which is the velocity dispersion of these vortices, right? Which is used here with kT, but that's sigma t. So delta sigma t corresponds to lambda times the sound speed in the microscopic case. Okay, so that's really an analogy with the macroscopic world, except now we are dealing with vortices. So you do the same for the Maxwell stress, delta sigma t, and for the electromotive force, you have two terms. One term which is proportional to the magnetic field, the mean magnetic field, and one term which is proportional to the current, the mean current. And so this is called turbulent resistivity. And this is called the alpha term, which is actually connected to a small-scale dynamo processes occurring inside your cell. Right? And this is called the magnetic viscosity tensor, and this is called the velocity viscosity tensor, or kinematic viscosity tensor. Okay, but of course, all these four boxes are related to turbulence, to unresolved turbulence, right? Okay, what is interesting though is that you can compare now how those guys look like, especially given the coefficient here that we have, delta, which is the cell size. Remember, the cell size, to the numerical viscosity that we have derived yesterday. And they are very comparable. They're the same, right? So these terms are actually have the same magnitude as the numerical viscosity that we have derived yesterday. So actually, the idea is that you don't need to include them, right? And unless your code is has very little numerical viscosity, you're using a very high order method, then you would have to need them. But most of the time, you don't need to include them unless you need the turbulent energy for other reasons, right? And that's my next point, right? So that's my first point here. The first message is that you might want to include them if you want, but they have the same order as the numerical viscosity. So what is, it's not really necessarily a good idea to include them. But you can if you want, right? There is another message here is that if you look at this equation here, you see that you have basically those guys are classical transport terms. This could be seen as the PDV work of the turbulent pressure, right? And then you have a source term, the source of turbulence, which is due to shear flows at large scales, minus the dissipation, right? And so Smagorinsky proposed a model where actually you solve this equation assuming that you have a stationary limit where you have balance between the source of turbulence, which is due to this guy, and the dissipation of turbulence, which is due to this guy. Right? So that's the stationary solution of the kinetic energy equation for turbulence. So, okay, let's solve that. Then you see that you have this equation where I've just injected in R the form I have here. And then you find the kinetic energy of turbulence. Right? So the kinetic energy of turbulence is given in every cell by this stationary solution. Right? And it's related to the dissipation function. It's called the dissipation function of the stress tensor. Right? And you see that it scales as the grid size to the square. And you can do the same for the magnetic helicity, the turbulent magnetic energy. You find also something similar. And so this is the Smagorinsky model, where basically you have your turbulent energy is obtained as the solution of an equilibrium between sources of turbulence and sinks of turbulence. Okay, so now you know basically in your code what is the level of your turbulence, of your subgrid turbulence, right? And as you say, it's a very complex theory, but it's relatively solid, I would say. And it depends on the scale of your simulation. It depends on the resolution of your simulation. Right? Of course, if delta goes to 0, at some point, you will converge to no turbulence anymore. Right? Okay, so how can you use this for our simulations? So there is one very interesting application in my mind, which is star formation. So we have seen yesterday and the day before, Yves describing the theory of star formation. But if you look at what we are doing in galaxy formation, actually it's quite naive. We use this very simple Schmidt law, which says that you form star at a rate which is given by a parameter epsilon times the gas density in the cell divided by the free fall time of the gas, and only if the gas is dense enough. Right? That's how we form star, right? At least traditionally. And those two parameters, epsilon FF or epsilon star and rho star, are calibrated in order to, for your simulation, to reproduce the Kennicutt relation in observed galaxies. Right? That's how you do it. That's the traditional way to do it. But after what we learned from Yves yesterday, it's clearly a very naive way of looking at the problem. And so here, I think what we can do much better. So I will actually go fast because Yves basically explained everything yesterday. But we know that inside those cells, gigantic cells that we have, the density fluctuations are log normal. Right? They are basically described by supersonic turbulence. And we know also that based on the model that Yves described yesterday, one of them, right, Krumholtz and Mackey, that you can derive a critical density above which you will form stars. And so that's the density distribution inside your cell. It's a log normal distribution. And then you can say, okay, if inside my cell I have a density larger than this, then I will form stars in those regions. Right? And that's the formula that Yves showed yesterday. That's the fraction of mass that will form stars. Right? And so if you know the turbulence, in your cell from the previous equations, you can derive the Mach number. You can also compute the density, the mean density in the cell, rho naught, that comes here. Right? And then you know everything. And you can derive what is the star formation efficiency in your cell, knowing your turbulence velocity dispersion. Of course, you need the sound speed, and knowing the density, the mean density in the cell. And then you can derive self-consistently, right, what is the efficiency of star formation as a function of the alpha Vir parameter of your cell and of the Mach number of the turbulence in your cell. And that's what you get. You get this shape. So, you know, it's a predictive theory for star formation, right? And so a lot of people are doing this. I mean, I'm going to report on the work by Semenov et al., where they did some simulation of galaxies where they actually know what is the turbulence. So they have a model for turbulence, Smagorinsky-like model for turbulence. So that's the map of the turbulence in their cell. That's the density and temperature. So they have everything, right? They have the viral parameter, they have the Mach number, and they compute epsilon FF based on a model similar to what I've shown on the previous slide. Right? So that's the star formation efficiency you get in your cells based on this model. Okay, so I think it's a nice way to incorporate subgrid physics, but in a way which is relatively controlled. So there's two components here. The first one is how do you treat turbulence? So you have to use this Smagorinsky/Boussinesq approach and describe your turbulence in each cell like that, right? And the second component, of course, is a theory of star formation based on knowing this turbulence and knowing the viral parameter in your cell. Then you can ask Yves what is the efficiency, and that's what you get, right? And I think this is quite predictive. Okay, let me quickly cut to the last thing here. Okay, so in the last couple of minutes I have, I want to talk about stellar feedback. So very briefly, but I think it's another aspect where subgrid approach can be meaningful. So you know this plot here, which tells you the stellar mass of the central galaxy divided by the halo mass as a function of halo mass for all the galaxies in the universe. So I will not explain where this comes from, but so we believe that that's how much star formation we have inside each of those halos in the central galaxy. And it peaks at 20% efficiency, which is quite low, but it's even worse at higher and lower masses. So that's the Milky Way. The Milky Way sits here. So we think that feedback does the job, supernovae feedback does the job on the left part of this plot, and AGN feedback does the job on the right part of this plot. So briefly, how do you implement supernovae feedback? So it's a very challenging task, right? Because supernovae are complicated objects. That's a nice Chandra image where you see those shocks here in blue. Actually, in white, those are relativistic particles. So you have a lot of particle acceleration. And then you have also a very complex geometry here in the middle. So these are very complex objects to capture. But just to quickly describe how we can do it. The key point here is that there is two phases in the supernovae blast wave evolution. There is an early phase where the energy is conserved, so that's the thermal energy as a function of the radius of the expanding blast wave. And you see that the thermal energy initially is conserved, and then when cooling kicks in, the thermal energy is lost by radiation, right? And you transit to a momentum conserving phase. So if you look at the momentum, the early phase, the momentum is growing, right? So the thermal energy, the bubble is pushing on the gas, and the momentum of the gas is increasing. But then at some point, once you reach this cooling regime, the momentum is conserved and is plateauing, right? So you reach what we call the terminal momentum of the supernova. And the key parameter here is the cooling radius, is the transition between this energy conserving and this momentum conserving phase. And the cooling radius is small, right? So that's the cooling radius for metallicity, solar metallicity gas. So you see that it's very small, meaning that it's very hard to resolve, right? But the physics is relatively under control here. So here I want to make the same point, and I will have to stop soon, that the physics is relatively known. So there is hope to incorporate this in a subgrid model, right? Basically, if you resolve the cooling radius, then you have nothing to do. You just inject thermal energy, and this thermal energy will be conserved. And then after some time, cooling will kick in. Cooling in your simulation will kick in, and you will resolve the entire blast wave evolution. But if you don't resolve the cooling radius, then you're in trouble. And then you need to use a subgrid model. And here, the subgrid model, which is used by many, many people, is to actually inject the terminal radial momentum, this momentum you get at the end, directly into the cell. And so here, the subgrid model is to inject the momentum directly in the environment of the exploding supernovae. And then you get a subgrid model which capture the right physics, right? Of course, how you do this momentum injection is another story, and a lot of technical details, but that's basically what I want to say. Okay, so let me quickly conclude by showing this last slide. So that's a slide that comes from this paper, a recent review on galaxy formation, which shows 6 nice galaxies simulated by 6 different codes. And so basically that's where we are now with this simulation. So I think we're much better than 20 years ago, I would say. But there is still a lot of stuff to understand. For example, I think none of these simulations use radiative transfer, right? They don't have enough resolution, I would say. But they use a lot of what I've discussed so far, star formation recipes, supernova feedback, subgrid models, and so on and so forth. And it seems that they are all getting galaxies which looks better and better. And so I hope you guys will do better with including radiative transfer and magnetic fields. Okay, thank you.
Any questions? Yes.
Okay, so you talked about the M1 closure for the momentum moments there, or the moment methods. Are there any other closure methods that are like commonly used or being explored or anything like that?
Yes, yes. So I didn't speak about it, but there is one method which is used in the Athena code, which is called the variable Eddington tensor method. It's also used in the ART code. It's used the optically thin variable Eddington tensor method. Right? So they're similar in philosophy. So here the idea is that in order to compute the pressure tensor, you solve a simplified radiative transfer model using ray tracing. Right? So in Nick Dedin's case, he's using an optically thin approximation. So light rays are going everywhere, and you compute the geometry of the radiation you get in this approximation. And this geometry, you put it in the Eddington tensor, and then you solve the moment equation. In Athena, the variable Eddington tensor approach, they use the short characteristic method. So here the approximation they assume that the radiation field is in a stationary state. So they assume stationarity for the radiation field, so they remove the d over dt factors, and they solve using a short characteristic method. They solve for the local radiation field evolution, and they get the geometry, And then they include this geometry into the Eddington tensor. So all these, so basically you can see these as different approximations of approximating the geometry. M1 being the simplest and the most radical, I would say, but also the only one being truly hyperbolic. The variable Eddington tensor method, it's much more expensive, but it's much more accurate than M1, right? But it still relies on an approximation, right? Either optically thin or stationary.
Any other questions?
So I have a question about your subgrid model for the turbulence. That eddy viscosity term you have is linear, but when you think of a turbulent cascade, the cascade would only transfer power non-linearly.
Mm-hmm.
So if you expect that there is some large-scale features from this cascade that are non-linear, then how do you reconcile that?
I think this Boussinesq approach is clearly a linear approach, exactly like Navier-Stokes is a linear approximation of the Boltzmann equation in a sense, right? So it's a first order thing, right? So I think the Boussinesq approach cannot reconcile with any nonlinear effects, right? Because it is a linear method. Right? It's basically a first order approximation of the truth. Clearly, there is much better to do. Yeah. But this is kind of the first order.
For your like eventual turbulence model that you kind of went through and simplified everything down to the stationary approach, what does stationary mean? Because, well, to me the ISM doesn't look that stationary. So.
No, so it means, yeah, it's a good question. So it means basically that, so you have in this equation, which is the turbulent kinetic energy equation, you have transport terms. So those are easy to understand. If you have turbulence here, you transport it there, right? So that's how you can increase the turbulent energy. But then you have also source terms. And those source terms, clearly, especially if you use the Boussinesq approximation, are clearly due to shear motions due to large-scale flow. So if you have large-scale shearing motions, then you will introduce turbulence, you will pump turbulence in the small scales. So this stationary approximation assumes that sources of kinetic energy of turbulence due to large-scale shear flows is balanced instantaneously by small-scale dissipation all the way down to the cascade. So it's a big approximation. Yeah. Especially if you factor in the fact that you have advection of turbulence and the PDV work and so on and so forth. But actually, it's interesting that you can compare what you get if you solve the kinetic energy equation and if you use the Smagorinsky limit, and they are not so different. But they are different, but not so different. Yeah.
So do cosmology simulations generally use the momentum-based radiative transfer instead of the ray tracing?
No. I think there is a relative
It seems that if you have something on megaparsec scales, then the infinite speed of light could actually affect things a lot.
Yeah, but it's true. But as you have seen in the test I've shown, the infinite speed of light compared to the true speed of light gives you an error of 20-30%, right, in the position of the fronts. If you use the moment method, you have to be able to deal with the correct speed of light, which is a challenge because your time step will be very small. And so here there is two approaches. Here I didn't have time to discuss this, but there is two approaches. One which is to use a reduced speed of light, so your time steps are not so small. But in case of cosmology, it's a disaster because then your front will be really slow, will be completely, stuck. Right? They will propagate way too slowly. Right? Or the other approach is to use the correct speed of light, a tiny time step, but then to use GPUs or whatever fast computing technique you have to speed up the process so that your radiative transfer is not slowing down too much your entire simulation. So again, right, moment-based methods, they need to rely on this finite speed of light approach. There is another approach, which is to have an implicit solver. So you don't need to have this time step constraint anymore. But an implicit solver is very complicated, very expensive also, and a lot of challenging steps to undertake when it comes to parallelization. So I think the main drawback of the ray tracing code is really the sensitivity to the number of sources. But otherwise, yeah, okay, infinite speed of light is a problem, but it's not just a big problem. 20%, I mean, in that field, it's not a big mistake.
So we'll stop here. If you have further questions, please ask over the coffee. So we're going to go into the coffee break. We'll come back at 11:30 in about 20 minutes.
Roland, did you want to announce?
Oh, yes. Yes, so I'm going to be leaving this afternoon after lunch. So if students want to chat about projects, I'm here until probably 2-ish.
Thank you. Let's thank Roman.